December 16th, 1944. The Ardennes Forest. American soldiers are drinking coffee, writing letters home. Some are still asleep in their bunks. It's supposed to be a quiet sector, a place where green troops get their feet wet and exhausted veterans catch their breath after months of fighting. Then, at 5:30 in the morning, the entire forest erupts. Over 1,800 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front. Within hours, 250,000 German soldiers, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, are pouring through the snow-covered hills. This is Hitler's final offensive in the West, the largest battle the American army has ever fought. Before it's over, 19,000 Americans will be dead. 80,000 casualties total, and the outcome of World War II will hang in the balance for nearly 6 weeks. This is the Battle of the Bulge. To understand why this battle happened at all, you have to understand just how desperate Germany's situation was by December 1944. 6 months earlier, Allied forces had landed at Normandy. By autumn, American and British armies were pushing toward Germany's western border, while the Soviets were crushing the Wehrmacht in the east. German cities were being reduced to rubble by round-the-clock bombing. The war was clearly lost. At least that's what everyone except Adolf Hitler believed. Hitler looked at a map and saw opportunity where his generals saw disaster. The Ardennes Forest, the same region where German panzers had shocked the world in 1940 by sweeping through supposedly impassable terrain to defeat France, could be used again. His plan was audacious, almost insane. German forces would punch through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, race 125 miles to the port of Antwerp, split the British and American armies in two, and circle and destroy 4 Allied armies, and force the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. Then Germany could focus all its remaining strength against the Soviets. His generals were horrified. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, reportedly called it an operation that hadn't the slightest chance of success. The Luftwaffe commander told Hitler they could guarantee air cover for exactly 1 day. After that, Allied air superiority would crush them. Germany didn't have the fuel, the ammunition, or the reserves to sustain such an offensive. But Hitler was beyond reason by this point. He gave the operation a grandiose name, Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, to make German commanders think it was a defensive operation. The attack was scheduled for mid-December, when bad weather would ground Allied aircraft. The Germans achieved something remarkable in the weeks leading up to the attack. They managed to assemble a massive strike force in complete secrecy. 3 armies totaling over 250,000 men, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and all that artillery were moved into position under radio silence. Units traveled only at night. Tanks had their treads wrapped in straw to muffle sound. The continuous roar of Allied bombers overhead actually helped mask the noise of German preparations. Luftwaffe fighters flew constant patrols over German lines to keep Allied reconnaissance planes away. American intelligence completely missed it. Oh, there were warnings. Ultra intercepts, the decoded German communications, showed increased activity. Some frontline units reported hearing sounds of tracked vehicles at night. A German woman crossed into American lines and reported seeing massive troop movements. But Allied commanders had convinced themselves that Germany was finished. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had even told reporters that the Germans couldn't launch another major offensive. The Ardennes was considered so safe that it was being used as a rest area. The American forces holding that 85-mile stretch were dangerously thin. The 8th Corps, under Major General Troy Middleton, had just 4 divisions covering terrain that military doctrine said required at least twice that many.
Two of those divisions, the 99th and 106th Infantry, were brand new to combat. Another, the 4th Infantry Division, was exhausted after months of brutal fighting in the Ardennes Forest. Only the 28th Infantry Division had significant combat experience in the sector, and they'd been badly mauled in previous fighting. The Americans had one soldier for every quarter mile of front. In some places, entire companies were responsible for a mile or more. When those 1,800 German guns opened fire on the morning of December 16th, many American soldiers had never experienced artillery bombardment before. The barrage lasted nearly 2 hours in some sectors. High explosive shells mixed with white phosphorus created an inferno that set the forest ablaze. Then came the ground assault. The German plan called for 3 armies to attack on parallel routes. In the north, the 6th SS Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, one of Hitler's oldest cronies, would make the main effort, breaking through toward the Meuse River crossings. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel would drive on Bastogne, a critical road junction. In the south, the 7th Army would protect the southern flank. If everything went according to plan, German tanks would reach the Meuse within 48 hours and Antwerp within a week. But the Americans, despite being caught completely by surprise, didn't collapse. This wasn't France in 1940. These were experienced, well-equipped soldiers who knew how to fight. In the northern sector, the Green 99th Infantry Division held their ground against repeated SS attacks. Near a village called Lanzerath, an intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of just 18 men held off an entire German battalion for nearly an entire day. By the time the Germans overran the position, the delay had thrown off their entire timetable. Still, the Germans made terrifying progress in some areas. The 106th Infantry Division, surrounded on the Schnee-Eifel Ridge, had 2 entire regiments, over 8,000 men, forced to surrender on December 19th. It was the largest mass surrender of American troops in the European theater. German panzer columns punched through American lines and raced west, leaving bypassed American units cut off and surrounded. And then there was Kampfgruppe Piper. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper commanded a battle group of around 5,000 SS troops with the mission of seizing bridges across the Meuse River. Piper was 29 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, and absolutely ruthless. His column of tanks and half-tracks carved through American positions, moving so fast that in some places they overran units before anyone realized the offensive had even started. On December 17th, near the Belgian town of Malmedy, Piper's men captured about 120 American soldiers, mostly from a field artillery observation battery. The Americans were disarmed and herded into a field. Then, according to survivors, the SS opened fire with machine guns. Men who tried to flee were hunted down and shot. Some Americans played dead in the snow. SS troops walked among the bodies, shooting anyone who showed signs of life. 84 Americans died in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. News of the massacre spread through American units like wildfire. It had exactly the opposite effect the Germans might have hoped for. Instead of terrorizing Americans into surrender, it hardened resistance. Soldiers who might have given up when surrounded now fought to the last bullet. According to some accounts, American troops began taking fewer prisoners, especially from SS units. The savagery escalated on both sides. Piper's battle group continued west, but they were running into problems. American engineers were blowing bridges before the Germans could capture them. Small American units, sometimes just a handful of tanks or a company of infantry, would suddenly appear and fight delaying actions that slowed the German advance by hours or days. Most critically, Piper was running out of fuel. His column captured an American fuel depot near Stavelot, but the Americans had set it on fire before retreating. By December 19th, Piper's spearhead was stalled near the town of Staumont, just 15 miles from the Meuse. American forces surrounded the battle group. Piper's men fought their way east on foot, abandoning all their vehicles. Of the roughly 5,000 men who started the offensive, about 800 made it back to German lines. The key to the entire German offensive was a small Belgian town most Americans had never heard of, Bastogne. 7 roads converged there, making it the critical transportation hub for the entire region. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the Ardennes. Hitler's planners knew this. So did the Americans. On December 18th, as the German offensive entered its 3rd day, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force finally grasped the scale of what was happening. Eisenhower met with his commanders in Verdun, appropriately enough, site of one of World War I's bloodiest battles. The mood was grim, but Eisenhower opened with a statement that became famous. The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster. There will be only cheerful faces at this table. General George S. Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south, had anticipated the meeting. He'd already ordered his staff to plan for wheeling his entire army 90 degrees north to strike the German flank. When Eisenhower asked how soon Patton could attack, Patton said December 22nd with 3 divisions. The other commanders were stunned. That meant moving an entire army over winter roads in 3 days, but Patton made good on his word. The race was on to reinforce Bastogne before the Germans could take it. The 101st Airborne Division, the famous Screaming Eagles, was resting near Reims, France, after brutal fighting in Holland. On December 17th, they got emergency orders to move to Bastogne immediately. The paratroopers didn't have their full equipment. Many didn't have winter gear. They loaded onto trucks and headed north through roads clogged with refugees and retreating American forces. They arrived just in time. The 101st, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and various other units, established a defensive perimeter around Bastogne on December 19th. By December 20th, the Germans had completely surrounded the town. The siege of Bastogne had begun. Defending Bastogne was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne. McAuliffe had about 18,000 men, a mix of airborne infantry, armored units, artillery, and stragglers from broken units who'd made it to the town. They had limited ammunition, not enough medical supplies, and the weather was so bad that resupply by air was impossible most days. The Germans threw everything they had at Bastogne. Artillery pounded the town constantly. Infantry attacks came from multiple directions. Panzer units probed for weak points in the American lines, but the paratroopers held. They'd been trained to fight surrounded. That's what paratroopers do, and they used every trick they knew. The American artillery, particularly the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, performed with deadly accuracy despite shortages of shells. Whenever German tanks massed for an attack, American gunners would break them up with precision fire. On December 22nd, with the weather clearing briefly, the Germans tried a different approach. 4 Germans, 2 officers, and 2 enlisted men approached American lines under a white flag. They were blindfolded and brought to a command post where they presented a written ultimatum. The German commander demanded the surrender of Bastogne, warning that if the Americans didn't surrender, they faced total annihilation by German artillery and aircraft. The message concluded with a threat. There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA troops from total annihilation. That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. The ultimatum was brought to General McAuliffe. According to his staff, McAuliffe read it, said, "Aw, nuts," and tossed it aside to deal with more pressing matters. When reminded that he needed to give the Germans a formal reply, McAuliffe struggled with how to phrase a refusal.
His operations officer suggested, "What you said initially would be hard to beat." And so the official American reply to the German surrender demand was a single word: nuts. The German officers were confused by the American slang. Colonel Joseph Harper, who delivered the message, had to explain that it meant "go to hell." The message became famous. When word spread through the American lines, morale soared. Here was their commander, surrounded and outnumbered, telling the Germans to go to hell. That was a message these soldiers could get behind. While Bastogne held, the Germans were running into problems everywhere. The weather that grounded Allied planes also created terrible conditions for their advance. Roads turned to mud, tanks bogged down or ran out of fuel, supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and the American soldiers, after the initial shock, were fighting back with increasing effectiveness. In the northern sector, the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red 1, and 2nd Armored Division stopped the 6th SS Panzer Army cold. A decisive engagement took place near the town of Elsenborn Ridge, where American forces established a defensive position the Germans never managed to break through. Every German attack was thrown back with heavy losses. By December 20th, it was clear that the northern thrust had failed completely. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army had made the deepest penetration, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name, but they were running out of steam. American resistance stiffened everywhere. Small towns that were supposed to fall in hours held out for days. St. Vith, another critical road junction, didn't fall until December 21st, and by then, the delay had been catastrophic for German timetables. The German offensive had counted on capturing American fuel supplies. Their own supplies couldn't sustain the operation. But American troops were destroying fuel dumps before retreating. The story of Piper's battle group running dry was repeated across the offensive. German tanks sat immobilized for lack of fuel, while American planes, once the weather cleared, hunted them down. On December 23rd, the weather finally broke. The skies over the Ardennes cleared for the first time in days, and the full weight of Allied air power fell on the German armies. Thousands of sorties flew that day and in the days following. Fighter bombers strafed German columns. Medium bombers hit supply depots and railroads. Heavy bombers pounded German positions. The Luftwaffe tried to contest the skies and was decimated. German pilots were now flying against overwhelming odds, many with minimal training. For Bastogne, the clear weather meant salvation. On December 23rd, the first supply drop arrived. C-47 cargo planes, escorted by fighters, dropped bundles of ammunition, medical supplies, and food. Not everything landed inside the perimeter. Some fell into German hands, but enough got through to keep the defense going. Over the following days, supply drops continued whenever weather permitted. On December 26th, elements of Patton's Third Army finally broke through to Bastogne. The 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, led by Lieutenant Charles Bulge, punched through German lines and made contact with the 101st Airborne. The siege was broken. McAuliffe greeted the tankers with typical understatement, "I'm awfully glad to see you." But the battle wasn't over. The Germans continued attacking, trying to cut the corridor to Bastogne. Some of the fiercest fighting of the entire offensive took place in late December and early January as the Americans tried to widen the corridor and the Germans tried to close it. Neither side gave an inch without terrible cost. By early January 1945, the German offensive was clearly doomed. They'd failed to reach the Meuse, let alone Antwerp. They'd suffered staggering casualties. Estimates range from 80,000 to 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns had been destroyed or abandoned. The Luftwaffe had been gutted in the air battles. Most critically,
Germany had used up reserves of men and equipment that could never be replaced. Hitler refused to authorize a retreat, even as Allied forces counterattacked from north and south, squeezing the Bulge. Hitler insisted his armies hold their positions. It was only in mid-January, with German forces in danger of being encircled themselves, that he finally authorized withdrawal to the original start line. By January 25th, the Bulge had been eliminated. The front was roughly where it had been on December 15th, except now Germany had lost an entire army's worth of combat power. For the Americans, the victory came at terrible cost. Official casualties were 89,500, about 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. The 106th Infantry Division effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Dozens of other units suffered crippling losses. Entire towns in Belgium and Luxembourg had been destroyed. Thousands of Belgian and Luxembourg civilians died in the fighting. But the Americans had done something remarkable. Caught by complete surprise, with inferior numbers, in the worst weather imaginable, they'd stopped the last German offensive of the war. Soldiers who'd been drinking coffee or sleeping when the attack began had held their ground and thought. Junior officers and NCOs, often cut off from higher command, had made critical decisions that shaped the battle. Engineer units had blown bridges at exactly the right moments. Artillery had fired accurately despite surrounded positions and ammunition shortages. And units like the 101st at Bastogne had demonstrated a level of stubborn courage that inspired generations of soldiers to come. The Battle of the Bulge broke the back of the German army in the West. The reserves Hitler had gambled on his final offensive were gone. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, German resistance was a shadow of what it had been. The war in Europe would be over by May. There are theories that the Battle of the Bulge actually delayed the end of the war, that if those German divisions had been used for defense instead of offense, the Allies would have faced a tougher fight in the final months. Maybe. But there's another way to look at it. Hitler's decision to attack revealed the fundamental delusion at the heart of Nazi Germany. Even facing certain defeat, Hitler believed he could still win through willpower and aggression. The Battle of the Bulge was the final proof that he was wrong. The battle also revealed something about American soldiers. They weren't supermen. They'd been caught by surprise, many were inexperienced, and in the first days some units had broken and run. But when the shock wore off, they stood and fought. At places like Elsenborn Ridge, Saint-Vith, and Bastogne, American soldiers proved they could match the Germans in courage and skill. The U.S. Army that emerged from the Ardennes was a veteran force that had earned its reputation the hard way. If you visit the Ardennes today, there are American cemeteries where thousands of white crosses mark the cost of that winter battle. In Bastogne, there's a monument shaped like a star, the Mardassin Memorial, dedicated to American forces who fought there. The town remembers. Every December, veterans and locals gather to commemorate the siege. Fewer veterans attend each year now, the youngest are in their late 90s, but the memory remains. One detail stayed with me while researching this battle. In late December, during some of the coldest days, American and German soldiers could sometimes hear each other across the snow-covered landscape. There are accounts of Germans and Americans shouting taunts, propaganda, even songs back and forth in the darkness. And then, at dawn, they'd try to kill each other again. That's the reality of the Battle of the Bulge. Not a clean strategic map with arrows showing advances and retreats, but scared, freezing men fighting in a snow-covered hell because their countries had sent them there. The Americans won because they fought harder, held longer, and had more resources. But mostly, they won because they refused to quit, even when quitting seemed like the rational choice. What do you think would have happened if the Germans had actually reached Antwerp? Would it have changed the outcome of the war, or just delayed the inevitable? Let me know in the comments. If you found this video interesting, there's a link to a documentary on the defense of St. Vith in the description. Another incredible story from this battle. And if you want to see more military history content like this, hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.